The afternoon sun streamed through the Family Feud studio windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished floor. Steve Harvey adjusted his tie and surveyed the two families positioned at their respective podiums. To his left stood the Peterson family from Ohio, 5 generations of teachers who'd driven 12 hours to be here. To his right, the Wilson family from Nebraska, and something about them immediately caught Steve's attention. There was a gravity to them that set them apart from the usual enthusiastic contestants. Bob Wilson, 72 years old with silver hair and weathered hands, stood slightly behind his family rather than at the center. His daughter Sarah, 45 and clearly the family organizer, kept glancing back at him with concern. Her husband Mike nodded encouragingly, but it was the 12-year-old boy standing closest to the podium who drew Steve's focus. Lucas Wilson had his grandfather's jawline and his mother's determined eyes, but there was something else, a maturity that seemed too heavy for his young shoulders. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and had combed his hair with obvious care. Most kids his age would be bouncing with excitement at being on television. Lucas stood perfectly still, his hand resting protectively on his grandfather's arm. "All right, family," Steve called out, his voice carrying its usual warmth. "We're about to start our survey, says, but first, let me get to know you folks a little better." He approached the Peterson family first, exchanging the typical pleasantries about their teaching backgrounds and their drive from Ohio. Their energy was infectious. Grandmother Janet kept waving at the cameras, and the youngest daughter couldn't stop giggling. Standard Family Feud fare. Then Steve moved to the Wilsons, and the studio's atmosphere shifted subtly. "Wilson family from Nebraska," Steve announced. "Sarah, you're the team captain. Tell me about your family." Sarah smiled, but there was tension around her eyes. "Well, Steve, we have my husband Mike. He's a mechanic. Our son Lucas here, who's 12 and the smartest kid I know. And this distinguished gentleman?" Steve gestured toward Bob. "That's my father, Bob Wilson. He's..." Sarah hesitated for just a moment. "He's a Vietnam veteran and the strongest man I've ever known." Bob stepped forward slightly, his posture unconsciously military despite the decades since his service. "Pleasure to be here, Mr. Harvey." Steve shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way Bob's eyes met his directly. "Thank you for your service, sir. How long were you in Vietnam?" 2 tours, 68 to 70, 1st Infantry Division. "The big red one," Steve nodded, recognizing the unit. "That's some serious combat." Bob's expression didn't change, but Lucas stepped closer to him. Steve noticed the boy's protective instinct immediately. "And Lucas, what grade are you in, young man?" "7th grade, sir." Lucas's voice was clear and respectful. "I'm here because I wanted Grandpa to have fun. He doesn't smile much anymore, but I thought maybe winning some money might help." The honesty in the boy's voice caught everyone off guard. Sarah's breath hitched slightly, and Mike put his arm around her shoulders. Bob looked down at his grandson with an expression that mixed love with something deeper, something that looked like regret. "Well," Steve said, recovering his composure, "let's see if we can get some smiles going. Y'all ready to play Family Feud?" The families took their positions. As the first round began, Steve noticed that while the Petersons were animated and loud, the Wilsons played with quiet intensity. Lucas answered questions with surprising wisdom for his age. Sarah and Mike worked as a team, consulting each other before each answer. But Bob remained mostly silent, offering suggestions only when directly asked. The game progressed normally through the first 2 rounds. The Wilsons took an early lead. Then the Petersons caught up. Lucas proved to be particularly sharp, nailing answers that stumped the adults. Each time he scored points, he'd look back at Bob with pride, seeking approval that his grandfather gave with small nods and rare, brief smiles. It was during the 3rd round that everything changed. Steve read the survey question with his usual theatrical flair. We asked 100 people, name something a father teaches his son. It should have been straightforward, the kind of question that generates answers like how to ride a bike, how to throw a ball, responsibility, respect, safe, family-friendly responses that keep the show moving. Sarah buzzed in first. "How to be a good man." "How to be a good man," Steve repeated, pointing toward the board. The number 2 answer flipped over, 28 points. The Petersons' turn. How to drive a car. Number 4 answer, 15 points. Back to the Wilsons. Mike stepped up confidently. How to work hard. Number 3, 18 points. The Petersons again. How to respect women. Number 5, 12 points. 2 strikes against the Petersons. 1 more wrong answer, and the Wilsons could steal. The pressure was on. All right, Wilson family, Steve announced, 2 strikes against the Petersons. 1 more wrong answer, and you can steal the round. Bob, you're up. Steve handed him the microphone, and for the first time since the show began, Bob Wilson looked uncertain. He stood at the podium, the microphone in his weathered hands, and something shifted in his expression. The military bearing faltered almost imperceptibly. Something a father teaches his son, Steve repeated, waiting for Bob's answer. Bob stared at the board, then down at the microphone. The seconds stretched longer than usual. The studio audience began to murmur softly, sensing something was wrong. Take your time, Bob, Steve encouraged. But Bob wasn't taking his time to think of an answer. Something else was happening. His hands began to shake slightly. The microphone trembled. Lucas stepped forward from the family line. Bob looked at his grandson, then back at Steve, then at the survey board listing the ways fathers guide their sons. His face contorted with an emotion too complex for television, too raw for a game show. Bob's voice cracked. The microphone slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a sharp electronic screech. Bob Wilson, veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, grandfather and father, doubled over as if he'd been struck. I couldn't teach him how to come home alive. The words came out as a broken whisper, but the studio microphones caught them. The audience fell completely silent. Steve Harvey, a man who'd handled thousands of emotional moments on television, stood frozen. Bob's legs buckled, and he would have fallen if Lucas hadn't moved with surprising speed to support him. The 12-year-old boy wrapped his arms around his grandfather's waist, holding him up with strength that seemed impossible for his size. "Grandpa, it's okay," Lucas whispered, but his voice carried in the stunned silence. "It's okay." Steve immediately signaled for the cameras to stop rolling, but the damage, if it could be called that, was already. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a man breaking open in front of America, held together only by the fierce love of a child. Sarah and Mike rushed to Bob's side, but Lucas didn't let go. Instead, he looked up at his grandfather with eyes that held no judgment, only love. "Grandpa," Lucas said, his young voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "Daddy would be proud of you. He told me so." The pronoun hit everyone like a physical blow. Told, past tense. The invisible wound that had been bleeding for years was finally visible. Steve knelt down beside them, his usual television persona completely abandoned. "Bob, talk to me, man. What's going on?" Bob straightened slowly, still leaning on Lucas. His eyes, when he finally looked at Steve, held a pain that was decades deep. "My son," Bob said, his voice raw. "Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson Jr., Bobby, Afghanistan, 2010. IED outside Kandahar." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The careful way Sarah had introduced her father, Lucas's protective instincts. The weight the family carried. This wasn't just a Vietnam veteran playing a game show. This was a Gold Star father. A man who'd buried his son after sending him to war.
"He was 28, Bob continued.
The words seeming to tear something inside him. Had a wife, a baby son. "That's Lucas. Bobby named him after me before he deployed." Steve looked at Lucas with new understanding. This wasn't just Bob's grandson. This was his son's legacy, the living continuation of a man who died in service to his country. "I taught Bobby everything I knew," Bob said, his voice gaining strength even as tears began to fall. "How to be a soldier, how to serve his country, how to be a man, but I couldn't teach him the most important thing. I couldn't teach him how to survive, how to come home." The studio was utterly silent except for the soft sounds of crying from the audience. Many of them were veterans themselves or military families who understood the particular grief of Gold Star parents. Lucas looked up at his grandfather, then at Steve, then at the cameras that were no longer rolling. When he spoke, his voice carried a wisdom that belonged to someone much older. "Mr. Harvey," Lucas said, "my daddy didn't die because Grandpa didn't teach him right. He died because he was protecting other soldiers. Grandpa taught him to be brave and to take care of people. That's exactly what Daddy was doing when he died." Steve felt his own composure cracking. In 30 years of television, he'd seen everything, but he'd never seen a 12-year-old boy console a broken grandfather with such profound grace. "Lucas," Steve said softly, "how do you know that?" "Because Grandpa told me all the stories, every one, about Daddy when he was little, about when he joined the army, about the letters he wrote. And I know that Daddy chose to be a soldier because he wanted to be like Grandpa. That's not Grandpa's fault. That's Grandpa being the best teacher ever." Bob looked down at his grandson as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The boy who'd been carrying the weight of an entire family's grief was offering absolution that Bob had never been able to give himself. "You really believe that?" Bob asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I know it," Lucas said firmly. "And you know what else? Daddy is still teaching me things through you. Every time you tell me a story about him, every time you show me how to fix something or how to be strong, that's Daddy teaching me too, through you." The simplicity and truth of it hit Bob like a revelation. He'd been so focused on what he couldn't teach his son, how to avoid the explosion that killed him, that he'd missed what he had taught him: courage, honor, sacrifice, love. Steve stood up slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just a personal moment anymore. This was something that needed to be shared, needed to be honored. He made a decision that would change the trajectory of the show. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced to the studio audience, "we're going to take a break from our regular programming. What we're witnessing here is more important than any game." He gestured for Bob and Lucas to follow him to center stage, away from the game show podiums and closer to the audience. Bob Wilson lost his son in Afghanistan in 2010. Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson Jr. died protecting his fellow soldiers. What we just witnessed here isn't just grief, it's the ongoing cost of freedom. It's what Gold Star families carry every single day. Steve's voice carried throughout the studio, but he was speaking directly to Bob and Lucas. "Bob, you asked me what fathers teach their sons. Let me tell you what you taught your boy. You taught him to serve something bigger than himself. You taught him to protect others even if it meant personal sacrifice. You taught him to be the kind of man who runs toward danger to save his brothers. That's not failure as a father. That's the highest form of success." Bob's tears were flowing freely now, but for the first time since Lucas had known him, they didn't seem like tears of pure sorrow. There was something else mixed in, a beginning of peace. "And Lucas," Steve continued, turning to the boy, "what you just did for your grandfather, that's exactly what your father would have done. That kind of love, that kind of loyalty, that kind of strength, that's your father living on through you." Lucas nodded solemnly, still holding his grandfather's hand. Steve looked out at the audience, many of whom were crying openly. "How many of y'all know a Gold Star family? Raise your hands." Dozens of hands went up throughout the studio. "How many of you have lost someone in service to this country?" More hands. Then you know that this man, Bob Wilson, represents thousands of parents who gave their children so that we could be free. And Lucas here represents all the grandchildren and children who grow up with that legacy. Steve paused, letting his words settle. "We're not going to finish this game today. Instead, we're going to do something different. We're going to honor Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson Jr. and every service member who didn't make it home." He signaled to his production team, and the familiar Family Feud music was replaced by something else. Taps began to play softly through the studio speakers. "Bob, Lucas, I want y'all to stand here while we observe a moment of silence for Bobby and for all the fallen." The entire studio contestants, audience, crew stood in respectful silence as taps played. Bob stood at attention despite his civilian clothes, muscle memory taking over. Lucas stood beside him, not quite at attention, but straight and proud. When the music ended, Steve spoke again. "Bob, I want you to know something. Your son's sacrifice wasn't in vain, and your teaching wasn't incomplete. Look at this boy standing next to you. Look at how he loves you, how he protects you, how he understands honor and sacrifice. That's your son's legacy. That's what Bobby died protecting the next generation, represented by Lucas. Bob looked down at his grandson and saw, perhaps for the first time, not a reminder of loss, but a promise of continuity. Mr. Harvey, Bob said, his voice stronger now, can I tell you something about my boy? Please do. Bobby used to say that he joined the army not to fight wars, but to end them. He believed that if good people were willing to serve, willing to sacrifice, then maybe his children wouldn't have to. He died believing that Lucas would grow up in a world that was a little bit safer because of what he and his brothers and sisters in arms were willing to do. Bob's voice grew stronger with each word. I've been angry for 8 years. Angry at myself. Angry at the army. Angry at God. But looking at Lucas now, hearing him defend me, seeing the man he's becoming, I think maybe Bobby succeeded. Maybe he did teach me how to help him come home, not physically, but in every value he passed down, every lesson that lives on in this boy. Lucas squeezed his grandfather's hand. See, Grandpa, you did teach him, and he's still teaching me. Steve wiped his eyes unashamedly. That's exactly right. The show that day never aired in its original format. Instead, it became something unprecedented. A special episode dedicated Gold Star families and the ongoing cost of freedom. The segment with Bob and Lucas became a centerpiece, but it was expanded to include interviews with other Gold Star parents, discussions about military sacrifice, and resources for families dealing with similar losses. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans organizations reached out to the show. Gold Star families from across the country share their stories. The episode became required viewing at military family support groups and was shown at Memorial Day events nationwide. But perhaps the most important outcome was simpler and more personal. 3 months later, Steve received a letter from Lucas Wilson. It was written in careful 12-year-old handwriting. Dear Mr. Harvey, thank you for helping Grandpa remember that Daddy's death wasn't his fault. Grandpa smiles now. Real smiles, not the fake ones he used to give me. He tells me stories about Daddy all the time now, and they're happy stories, not just sad ones. We're gonna visit Daddy's grave next month for the first time since I was little. Grandpa says he's ready to tell Daddy about all the things I've learned and how proud Daddy would be. Also, Grandpa is teaching me how to fix cars in his garage. He says Daddy loved working on cars too, so when I learn, it's like Daddy is teaching me through Grandpa, just like I told you on the show. Mom says people all over the country saw our show and that it helped other families like ours. That makes me proud. I think Daddy would be proud too. Thank you for letting us tell people about Daddy. Thank you for helping Grandpa understand that good teaching and brave soldiers sometimes means people don't come home, but their love and lessons do. Your friend, Lucas Wilson. P.S. Grandpa says he'd like to come back on the show someday, but only if you promise to ask easier questions. Steve kept that letter in his dressing room, framed next to a photo from that remarkable day. Bob Wilson standing at attention during taps with Lucas beside him, both of them no longer broken by grief, but strengthened by love and legacy. The photo reminded him daily that television, at its best, isn't about entertainment. It's about truth, healing, and the recognition that some stories are too important to be contained within the boundaries of a game show. Bob Wilson never did learn how to teach his son to come home alive from war, but he learned something perhaps more important, how to let his son's sacrifice give meaning to life, and how to help that meaning live on in the next generation. And Lucas Wilson learned that being the grandson of a hero doesn't mean carrying the weight of tragedy, but carrying forward the light of love, service, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us across the generations, even when death tries to sever them. The game show ended that day, but something more important began. A family's healing, a nation's remembrance, and a boy's understanding that his father's death was not the end of his story, but the beginning of his own.